reimagining the scope of social health in the context of public health in the United States. Hello, my name is Dr. Marisa Murray in the School of Public Health Bloomington at Indiana University. I'm in the Department of Applied Health Science, where I serve as the Director of Undergraduate Studies, and I'm also an Associate Clinical Professor focusing on human development and family studies. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. You might have joined Dr. John Sefrin for the introduction to this entire webinar series a couple of weeks ago. In the upcoming series, you might find that presenters may have community partners with them. For this particular webinar today, I am going to give some thoughts on the overall idea of social health in the United States, traditionally, and then maybe what we might do to suggest other aspects of social health that are very important. So without further ado, I will just use these objectives as benchmarks for you to be able to figure out where I'm going with this presentation. There's going to be about 4 benchmarks overall. The first will be that I'll simply tell you about the traditional idea of social health in the United States. Then I'm going to share some general findings of Indiana data that we have in the state that might indicate other ideas of social health and how people are experiencing that. We'll use that Indiana data in the third objective to help inform the broader national conversation around social health. And then finally, I'm going to make some suggestions where I bring together both the traditional model of social health and bring in ideas that we have here in the School of Public Health related to our vision statement, big, bold ideas. So without further ado, I'd like to just start with a very general presupposition that I have throughout this entire webinar, and that's very simple. It's the idea that perhaps oversimplification of something that is so important as our health might not be working for us as well as we'd like to think it is. So I'm actually advocating that we take a bit more of a broader scope, a more complex idea of social health ultimately. Again, the presupposition is that oversimplification might not be working for us overall. But let's start with the first question. How is social health defined in the United States? Well, again, if you happen to be tuning in for Dr. Sefrin's webinar, he mentioned the Dimensions of Wellness model from SAMHSA. And SAMHSA mentioned in their various ideas of health overall, but they go on to define social health as developing a sense of connection, belonging, and well-developed support system. You'll see that over on the right-hand side of your PowerPoint slide if you happen to be looking at the PowerPoint. Very general idea of what social health is, and we've used it for quite a while, but we'll go on, as I said earlier in the webinar, to ask ourselves, is this working best for us even in the year 2016? Maybe we'll be able to build on that firm foundation from SAMHSA and have some better informed data of social health. So the next question becomes, what might people be experiencing around social health in our good state of Indiana? And our School of Public Health happens to have done a couple of studies that speak to this overall idea. The very first study was conducted in 7 rural counties in the Hoosier State. With over 3,600 participants in this study, they were interested in finding out aspects of health overall. Their random samples of residents were asked to provide perceptions of their overall well-being using standardized quality of life measures from the CDC. Now, very briefly, there were 2 main themes that emerged. One is that overall, people were very aware of social health. That sounds like not a big finding, but it actually is, because typically people would discuss aspects of health such as physical health or mental health, but repeatedly they kept alluding to social health. So even that is just very interesting. And the participants who did refer to their social health, they discussed their social health as being better than their physical health and their mental health, which is interesting. Another theme that we found with that particular data set was that both men and women who were over the age of 65 indicated that they had declined experiences with social health. You'll see this in the two graphs that are on your screen. And that was a little concerning. We tend to think of social health when we do think of it, which sparsely we do, but when we do, we often don't think about it in terms of folks who are over the age of 65. So public health programs often focus on physical health as a priority for aging adults. We're used to that idea. But our data suggests that both social health and medical programs are highly important for aging folks. These findings are very consistent with another study that I'm going to briefly share with you within the School of Public Health Bloomington. And within this study, we had a group of students that actually collected the data from 300 participants in a city softball league. Very interestingly, the city believed that most of the participants in that softball league would have attributed their participation in softball to a desire to improve physical health. That just makes rational sense that they would assume that. But overwhelmingly, participants in this study, they said that boosting their social well-being was the single most important reason why they participated in softball. That was interesting. Moreover, there seemed to be an overflow effect with that regarding their spouses and partners. Not only did the players have a positive perception, but their partners and their spouses documented improved social health and well-being overall simply by going to the softball fields and interacting with others while their significant other played. So interestingly enough, we think of, okay, this is in the state of Indiana. What if anything, do these studies mean regarding social health? In general, what this says is that social health tends to play a big role in terms of surfacing to an area where we think, this isn't as important as we would once think that it would be. Perhaps this speaks to the notion that we might need to widen our scope. We know that it matters with regard to aging and participating in community events overall in the state of Indiana, but maybe, if nothing else, we need to widen our scope. So if we go a little bit deeper, just a tad deeper, we might ask ourselves, well, how might these Indiana findings help to inform our broader national conversation regarding social health? And I would say that as I began to think through, how might this inform it? I thought, okay, we understand aging, we understand community involvement in city league kind of community activities. Okay, social health is important. And I began to pan back and wonder, why might the larger, broader United States majority culture struggle with the idea of including social health as a serious health measure? And I had to think about that. And at first I thought overall about the United States population of we who are public health professionals. But then I thought about myself as an ethnic family researcher, and I thought, very interestingly, I'm very aware that majority culture versus minority ethnic families or indigenous family groups, such as American Indian, African American, Latino, Asian American families, the smaller, more marginalized indigenous peoples, they might have a more coherent idea of how to use social health because they're in the margins. Social and informal networks are a key part of the peer-reviewed literature that exists in our fields regarding these smaller groups. So there's an idea that I'll mention later, but I'll allude to it right now. Spoiler alert. It involves the idea that maybe minority families might be able to help inform our larger, broader conversation around social health and why social connectedness really works. Perhaps those who usually have to rely on each other can help inform the larger U.S. context where we're used to being more rugged individualist. So, as we begin to think this through more and more, I thought, well, maybe there's a reticence for some of us to say, well, we don't really have time to think about what does social health even mean? if we got to know more about a particular gender, a particular religion, a particular age group, that takes time, that takes resources, that takes a lot of patience that we might not have. So let's just leave social health alone. Let's just leave it to the side as if it's a more general idea of health rather than something that's more intrinsic. But no matter how busy we are and how limited time we feel like we tend to have in our daily lives, the data from Indiana seems to still indicate that there is a strong craving and hunger for human interaction. So there's a place where we come, maybe as researchers, where we say maybe it's time to embrace the complexity in social relationships, the importance of these smaller demographic variables. And in doing so, maybe we need to not allow ourselves to get as bogged down in the idea of perfecting it right off the bat. Perhaps the mere attempt, as you'll see on your slide, perhaps the mere attempt to engage with each other socially. Maybe not knowing the right words to say to one another. Maybe we don't always know the new correct label to label someone with, or new language, but the mere attempt to engage with one another to do so, maybe that would be enough to help bolster the overall social health aspect that we have in the United States. Overall, we think about things that are off the table topics, such as race, religion, and politics. I said ethnicity in the slide because ethnicity deals more with clothing, with customs, with language, with values of a particular group. But these tend to be very taboo subjects when you're trying to bond with someone, right? They say avoid those topics at all costs and then everything will go smoothly. However, maybe it's okay that we begin to broach some of those harder topics that are actually bothering us on a regular basis. I have on the slide an example with maybe considering, as an example, the social problems in which the Black Lives Matter movement emerged in the country. And there was some call with that movement where people would say, well, you know, maybe we don't all need to engage in that, or that feels like a very subversive movement. However, if we take the fear off of that and say, you know, maybe if we begin to look at the social problems in which that movement emerged, and not just look at the Black lives, but say, okay, please look at the Black lives that matter. And with those Black lives being improved, perhaps me as an Asian American man next to a Black life, maybe that impacts me as well. So I'll allude to this, I'll get to it later when I talk about the big, bold idea. There's a big, bold idea that we have in the School of Public Health, which kind of asserts that we're all better when we're all better. So perhaps Black lives mattering more means that all of the lives in the United States matter more. But let's take the time to understand why Black lives matter. So that's very interesting in terms of expanding that national conversation. So if we go even deeper with that national conversation, one might say, okay, we've mentioned a particular movement in which social problems in the United States made it salient. How might social media also play a role in social health as we move forward? So we know one thing, we know that social health is here to stay. Another thing that we basically know is that we tend to think of social health among younger generations, although the data is beginning to indicate more and more that those who are over the age of 50 and actually even 65 use Facebook and other email accounts to see pictures of family and friends on a regular basis. Social media is being used as a very strong connecting element. We understand that social networks matter with social media. We're used to saying the term social media, but we're not really used to using the term social health very much. But what if we take this deepened idea of conversation a little farther and we say, okay, social networks are being fostered more with social media within a particular group. Now, what if we expand that idea going from group to group, whereby we don't water down, as I said in the last example, we don't water down the need for a movement with a whole group. We also don't water down a whole social media connected group, say in the left hand. Maybe the right hand looks at another group and says, we don't know much about what's happening in group A. Might we learn more from you? Could you tell us more about why this matters to you? Whether it's joy or pain, it's the social connectedness. It's creating the idea of social empathy. Perhaps in social health, we can use social media to help create social empathy from one group to another. Just a consideration. Now, my very last actually objective that I mentioned with this webinar series was, are there specific ways in which the School of Public Health Bloomington, our big bold ideas, might they be related to an idea of a more sophisticated, culturally inclusive, intentionally generous, and generationally relevant perspective of social health across the lifespan? The answer is yes. Of course, you know that if I pose that question, the answer is absolutely going to be yes. I actually contend that it can. This will be very simple. It appears to be a very intimidating slide in terms of how much is on it, but just follow what I say. It'll make sense to you. And I start with that very traditional model that I mentioned at the very beginning from SAMHSA, in which SAMHSA described social health as developing a well-developed connection, belonging, and a well-developed social support system. Okay, well, in the School of Public Health Bloomington, less than a year ago, 6 months to a year ago, we took time to ask ourselves, now that we are a school that's accredited, a School of Public Health, who do we want to be? How are we different than any other School of Public Health? What do we want to do? How do we make a difference in the world? So we got together, we thought this through, and there's actually a set of, quote, big, bold ideas. There are 11 of them that involve the vision of the School of Public Health Bloomington. I actually was a part of that vision committee, and I was glad to be a part of that vision committee. And I went back to those big, bold ideas, and I revisited them thinking about this notion of social health that I'm talking about today. And I said, it appears to me that there are possibly 3 overlapping areas that might help us inform the broader conversation with regard to social health. The very first one is very obvious, that public health can be reimagined. And that's what I'm doing today. I'm playing with the idea of including in it social media. I hadn't mentioned this, but I'll mention the idea of even how we manage bullying through social media. That bullying can be a very positive social media can be a very positive management tool in terms of bullying, but it can also be the conduit used to bully people. So let's take the negative and use it to the positive. Let's reimagine it. Public health reimagined. Yet let's use some of the tools in a new way. But the piece that I mentioned earlier about we're all better when we're all better, that's actually located under the big, bold idea from within our school called social ecological interconnectedness, in which we reorient the worldview beyond an individual need, focus on the perspective of, quote, we're all better when we're all better. And finally, but not in any way last, is the idea of social civility. And that's actually based upon a scripture in which there's mention of God's mercy triumphing over judgment. And it's this expand the idea of social justice to move into a demonstrated place of generosity, mercy, and gracious space. The idea here is that instead of something just being exactly just, 1 equals 1, it would be the notion of, you know what, you just asked for 1, let's give you 2. You've earned 2 here. Yes, I have limited time, limited resources. Take it. Please, let's be generous with one another. Let's be merciful with one another. And also let's lean into a space that's very forgiving when it comes to maybe missing it a little socially, where I alluded to the idea of maybe misusing a term every now and then, that we maybe give credit for the mere attempt, the genuine and respectful attempt to connect with one another on a social level, that maybe that matters most. So social civility. And I'll conclude with the overall idea that's very simple. Social health is very important. It is going to be more and more important for us to measure it in the field of public health moving forward. I will also say, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, but now I'll really bring it home, is this idea that perhaps the more marginalized and indigenous groups within our larger society could help inform the broader U.S. population on ways in which we can best use social health, interconnectedness, both formal and informal networks. Let's invite those more marginalized groups to the table to inform us on how we might be able to measure this better and think about acknowledging these parts of ourselves that truly do matter. Last but not least, let's work from a foundation of resource abundance rather than resource scarcity. We have enough time to share. We have enough patience to share with one another. And let's bring this into both research, teaching, and actually even professional practice. So thank you again for your time. It's been a pleasure being with you here today.